coming to you from the Parish Healthcare Podcast Studio.
Hey there, thanks for coming under the rainbow with us. I'm Jorge Estevez. Along with my friends, we are talking LGBTQ+, whether you're one of us or you're an ally. Welcome to the show that isn't afraid to talk about it. And you are correct. We are not afraid to talk about it. Hello and welcome to Under the Rainbow. I'm Jorge Estevez, our first inaugural podcast. Thank you so much for listening. It's my first time trying to do this, but the goal is to do something and talk about something you're familiar with. I'm an anchor at WFTV Channel 9 here in Orlando, Florida, and I'm a member of the LGBTQ community. I'm the G in the LGBTQ+, I guess you would say. And it's a gift for me to bring this to you, and a lot of people came up with an idea to do a podcast because we're all living under the rainbow, but I think we should all better understand who we are, why we are who we are, and how we can all be better human beings. And it's not just a podcast, you guys, for the LGBTQ plus community. It's for our allies. It's for our relatives. It's for our friends. It's for people who just want to understand a little bit more so we can all coexist. And I'm not doing this alone, so I'm going to introduce to you our expert panelists right now. To my right, tell them who you are and why you're a big deal.
Hi, everyone. I'm Gina Duncan. I'm the State Director of Transgender Equality at Equality Florida.
Fantastic. And to my left?
Hey, everybody. I'm Ez Rodriguez. My pronouns are they, them, theirs, and I'm the Pinellas Safe and Healthy Schools Coordinator with Equality Florida.
And?
I am George Wallace. My pronouns are he, him, his, and I am the Executive Director of the LGBT Plus Center in Orlando and Kissimmee.
Fantastic. Congratulations on the Kissimmee opening, by the way. That was how long ago now?
A year, last week.
That is incredible.
That's
Happy anniversary to you.
Thank you.
All right, so it's interesting. First off the bat, Gina, I noticed that you guys introduced yourselves, George Wallace and Ez Rodriguez, and you used your pronouns. Ez, why did you do that?
I do that because it's really important that we model that, gender identity is not something that you can see in people because we're only the people who are experts of our own experience in the world. So instead of misgendering someone, I let people know what my pronouns are so they know what to use when they refer to me when I'm not in the room. Pronouns aren't really scary. You can do it.
And people have a challenge doing it, and I wonder why that is. You identify as?
A non-binary person.
What does that mean? Let's tackle that label.
Sure. So non-binary is, folks in our community have different ways of describing it, but for me, it's something that's outside the typical definition of what's masculine and feminine at our present time in society in our country, because we're always talking about gender and sexuality from a context of current day U.S. culture. So at least what we're talking about now. Because when you go transnationally, there are very different ways to talk about gender and sexuality. According
to HRC, Human Rights Campaign, non-binary, an adjective describing a person who does not identify exclusively as a man or a woman. When did this start for you, Ez?
Well, I like to say I came out twice. I came out in college, and I thought I was gay, which I am. I'm queer. But then when I just kept, when something's wrong, when you're wearing a misfitting suit or something like that.
Right.
It was almost like I was trying to fit into this category of being assigned female at birth, and that didn't really feel right to me. So then I said, I must be a boy. So then I tried that, and he, him pronouns, and that didn't seem right, but definitely was closer. And then when I found they, them pronouns and the label non-binary, I actually fit into my shoes and my clothes and my identity, and it made me really happy I can be who I am.
And we talked about you. Let's talk about George Wallace now. So you identify as?
Queer.
Okay, and that means what to you?
I've always identified as a gay man, but I recently have taken the word queer and use it more for empowerment because growing up, my grandfather would say, oh my gosh, look at those queers, but he didn't mean it in a positive way. So I have now just taken that word and I use that to describe my orientation because, I don't want that word to hurt me anymore because it hurt me as a kid because
right.
I knew I was different. I didn't know what I was.
And it's interesting you should bring that up that way because, and before we get to Gina Duncan, I just want to interject with this story. This podcast is called Under the Rainbow, right? Because I think we all live under the rainbow. And one of the words tossed around to call it was queer town. Sure. And some people thought that would be offensive. And do you think that's a generational thing? Gina, I ask you, is that a generational thing, the word queer? Because I feel like the millennials and the generations coming up before us that are now in their 20s, who are now in their 20s, don't find it offensive.
Yeah, I agree. language within our community is evolving over the years. I remember as a child, if I said queer, I'd get my mouth washed out with soap by my dad. But now queer can be used to describe the entire community. I know I wrote for a while for Huffington Post, and our articles were called Queer Voices. So queer has become a term that's used very positively within the community and describes the entire community, or it can describe people who fall within queer spaces.
Martina Moritza saying hello, Deb chiming in, Danny Garcia chiming in, Bonnie Hector. We're live on Facebook simultaneously when we put this live to tape to get some reaction from viewers. Gina, tell us your story.
Well, I identify as binary in the fact that I lived for 50 years as a male. Even though my gender identity, my deeply held sense, my belief of who I was and how I interacted with the world, I always felt feminine inside. But my assigned sex at birth was male. I lived for 50 years presenting as male and dealing with gender dysphoria, knowing that my gender identity did not align with the physical being that I was living in the world. So when I turned 50, I decided to transition and to live my authentic life and to embrace who I truly was and transition to being Gina Duncan.
And you worked so tirelessly to help so many members of the trans community, the LGBTQ plus community, everyone. How has that changed or given your, can I call it new life, new sense of self, purpose or more purpose? Is that appropriate?
Yeah, absolutely. It's almost like everything in my life has led to this point, and the work I do now is absolutely the passion of my life, and it's something that I always say that I have the best job in the world. And a part of that is moving the needle in reference to people understanding the gender constructs that we have developed over the years and how we move even beyond gender constructs. We move beyond gender in reference to identifying people or marginalizing people based on their gender.
George Wallace, people come to the center with all sorts of questions and all sorts of problems and issues. Is this one of them? What am I? Am I cis, pan, trans? What am I?
They do, and we have counselors that can help them. We have a lot of groups that meet there as well, and we take it very seriously. A lot of times people will come in and our volunteers, we're not perfect, we're human, and sometimes I hear, oh my gosh, I was misgendered, and it's the LGBT Center. So we have started a training program with our volunteers where they go through, and it's a pronoun training. And I learn something new every single day. And, one of the things that I always say, I have a pin on that says he, him, his. I wear it a lot. I wear it out in public, and that is people like, oh, why do you wear that? And I tell them.
First question I asked you.
Yeah, and it's because I identify as male, and sometimes it'll open up even more questions. But as was stated earlier, you cannot just, you can't look at someone and assume their identity.
No, you sure can't. And Lee Lazardo asked on my Facebook page, I think having so many labels for people is confusing and not really necessary. We're all humans, and it shouldn't matter who you are or how you identify yourself. Everyone matters. Ez, let me ask you, does it matter? Why do we need labels?
I think labels are something that we use to communicate parts of who we are, what we want, how we want to show up in relationship with other people.
Does that divide us? Does that unite us? What does that do?
It depends on how you use it and your motive, right? So telling someone about my gender identity or my sexual orientation, which just to mention are two separate things for everybody, right? Some people put them together and think gender identity and sexual orientation are the same thing. But when I tell someone that, I think that they can get a better picture of who I am and how I relate in the world.
And I think it's important to note that when people express discomfort in using pronouns or declaring what their pronouns are, one's discomfort should not override validating someone's existence and respecting who they are and using the right pronouns that they live their life by.
Now, you discussed as your sexual orientation is not the same as your what?
Gender identity.
What is your sexual orientation?
Well, it's queer. But So sexual orientation is to whom you're attracted and who you want to be attracted back to you. And your gender identity is who you know yourself to be on the inside.
So let me ask you a question that may or may not be any of my business. Who are you attracted to?
My fiance.
Okay, fantastic. That's a fantastic answer.
3.5 years.
Okay, and what does your fiance identify as?
She identifies as a gay woman and uses she, her pronouns.
That is fascinating. And I don't know how to follow that up because that is such a fascinating answer. And it's true, but some people are like, what does that mean? For example, there's someone here saying, what's the difference between gay, lesbian, and queer? What is the difference?
Okay, well, gay is typically, if I'm going to answer that, is going to be a man, although some women identify as gay. I've never heard a man identify as lesbian. That is a female.
Because I think it's fair to say gay was like a blanket term decades ago.
Yeah,
that clumped us all in.
Do you remember when Ellen came out and she's like, "I'm gay"?
Right.
That was the first time I ever saw a woman identify as gay.
Right.
Well, and I think it's important that people understand the difference between sexual orientation and gender identity. And sometimes you can put it down, you can phrase it this way, that your gender identity is who you go to bed as, and your sexual orientation is who you go to bed with.
So in my case, I go to bed as a man, and I go to bed with a man, and sometimes my Shih Tzu.
So your gender identity would be what?
My gender identity is I'm a gay man.
Okay. So you're male.
I'm male.
And your sexual orientation would be?
Gay.
Right.
Which makes me a gay male.
Oftentimes, when I'm doing workshops, I put myself out there as an example, and I do the same thing. So what is my gender identity? And they say, well, you identify in the binary as a female. And I'm like, okay, and I date men. So what is my sexual orientation? And oftentimes that stumps the audience. They scratch their head and they look confused. And I say, I'm straight. And you see,
mind blown.
Yeah, but when I often say, when in doubt, default to one's gender identity, and then based on their gender identity, you can then relate to someone's sexual orientation, who they may be attracted to, but you always default to their gender identity first.
All right, so some of the labels here that I looked up, the Human Rights Campaign. By the way, you're listening to Under the Rainbow with Jorge Estevez, and the goal of today is talking about labels, right? So we have a couple of labels here, which we all know. Let's play a little game I like to call, Do You Know This Label? Okay, androgynous. Everyone knows what androgynous is to some degree. How would you define it? It says here, identifying and or presenting as neither distinguishably masculine nor feminine. So famous androgynous...
Grace Jones.
What?
Grace
Jones, exactly.
Good example, yeah.
Back when we were younger. Asexual, that's another label. The lack of sexual attraction or desire for other people. Can you really be asexual?
Yeah.
Definitely.
Okay, Ez, take that.
Yeah, I work with a lot of students who feel like they want to form relationships with people, but they're not interested in a sexual or physical aspect of that relationship. And it's important to note that asexuality exists on a spectrum. So some folks who are ace will say, well, if I get to know you and I'm in a relationship with you, I might start to feel something. And some people are like, no, I just don't want that to be part of our relationship. But it doesn't mean that they're aromantic.
Ooh, I like that. Jason Jose chimes in saying, hey, George, listen to this, you guys. I'm watching with my 15-year-old daughter who is bisexual and non-binary. It's awesome for her to have great parents to support her. George, thank you for doing this. Jason's watching with his 15-year-old daughter. Isn't it incredible, and you teach this around the country, how this topic of conversation is starting to happen at a younger and younger age? Is it appropriate? Is it not appropriate? What do you think?
It's very appropriate. Kids are coming out at a younger and younger age, and it's so important that parents have the education to support them and have the resources to support them. We have a drastically high attempted suicide rate of young people when they come out at a young age, that when they are rejected by their family, when they do become homeless, they're thrown out of their homes or whatever, the suicide rate of young people is staggeringly high. Alarmingly, it's close to 50% attempted suicide rate of kids at K through 12 who consider themselves gender non-binary or gender non-conforming.
And George Wallace, executive director of the LGBT Plus Center
Correct.
In Orlando.
Yeah.
How do you deal with this? Because you get a lot of young people walking through those doors.
We do, and we were fortunate enough to have some parents come to us and say, hey, my 9-year-old is transgender. And I reached out.
How do they know at 9? Anyone?
How do you know you're straight at 9? How do you know you're cisgender at 9? Right?
There we go. Exactly.
I often say to people, do you remember the day you decided what your gender would be? Was it a Saturday? Was it in June? And everybody goes, No hands are raised. Gender chooses us. We don't get to choose our gender.
And the light bulb just goes off one Saturday or on a random Tuesday in June? Did it go off for you like that?
I think it was more of a process, and it's still a process because identity is a process. And one other thing, when we talk about talking to young people and giving parents and teachers the tools to talk about these subjects, it also lays a really good basis for consent in relationships and forming healthy relationships and helping kids distinguish between unhealthy, healthy, and abusive relationships.
And George, you were talking about the youth coming into the center.
Yeah, so we were fortunate enough to have some parents, and they created a group, and it meets once a month, and we proudly serve our youngest person that is in the group is 7 years old. It's for 7 to 13-year-olds. And then there are some fantastic organizations here in Central Florida, Orlando Youth Alliance and the Zebra Coalition, that serve 14 to 24-year-olds. So there was a gap. So we're trying to help fill that because kids are coming out younger and younger.
And is this a whole new level of coming out? As you so candidly said, you've come out twice. And you could still come out a third time, I guess. Someone here saying, Gavin chiming in on Facebook, I hope that one day people no longer have to come out, that people can just say who they are and it not be an issue. Will we ever see that day? Will podcasts like these, conversations like this, help get that day closer?
I hope so.
I think so, because we're actually going towards changing the language in certain circles from coming out to letting people in. So I think that really changes the onus. A lot of kids that I work with are scared that if they come out to their families might say, oh my God, you lied to me your whole life.
Right.
So when you can let everyone in, it feels a different way.
All right, go ahead, Gina.
Well, I was going to say, and as gender becomes more and more fluid and is less of categories and constructs and things like that, I think our community will develop more as a more inclusive community. I remember when Chaz Bono came to UCF, I had the pleasure of introducing Chaz, and I remember looking out over the audience, 250 college-age kids, and there was this amazing rainbow of identities and genders and sexual orientations. Most of the kids in the auditorium, I couldn't tell what gender they were, but the energy and the love and the acceptance and the inclusion in that room was palatable. And it was like, is this what our the next generation will look like, or how long will it take before generational changes get us to that point?
Will it no longer matter? Do we not need to have this conversation in 20 years or 30 years?
I hope so. Well, here's a funny story. So my nephew in 2015, when marriage equality was passed, and my sister said, Uncle George and Joe can get married now. And he just looked over and said, they can't. What do you mean they can now? It's like this, it's a thing. This is like a 9-year-old, 10-year-old. And it was just like, he just knew that, he had 2 uncles and they loved each other.
And that was it.
And it was it. It was like, what do you mean they can't get married? Like, it's just like, so, it's something that is taught, And unfortunately, we're seeing more and more crimes against LGBTQ communities, especially transgender.
And that's why labels and understanding and figuring out and being true to who you are and having people in, as you said, is fantastic. All right, so game time. Cisgender. Cisgender. A term used to describe a person whose gender identity aligns with those typically associated with the sex assigned to them at birth. What does that mean?
Basically means if you're cisgender, you're not transgender.
I am cisgender. I'm a man. I was born a man. I identify as a man.
Fantastic. Gay, a person who's emotionally, romantically, or sexually attracted to members of the same gender. Gender expansive conveys a wider, more flexible range of gender identity and or expression that typically associated with the binary gender system. What does that mean?
Go ahead.
Gender expansive is a little bit different than like gender fluid or non-binary, and it's for folks who are expressing outside of binary categories. So oftentimes we will see cisgender kids being gender expansive. So a little boy, but maybe wanting to do things that people have termed very feminine.
Like playing with Barbies, to be totally typical and ridiculous.
I love
Exactly.
Barbie.
And who doesn't want little boys to play with dolls? Because if they're going to parent when they get older, that's a great experience.
Now I can understand why I always borrowed Ken. From my cousin. All right, so gender nonconforming. Were we talking about that before we went up about, do people even use that anymore?
I think it's fading out. Gender non-binary is the preferred term. That is the contrast between binary of maleness and femaleness and people who are non-binary who don't fall in those two categories.
Okay.
Sometimes a mix, sometimes neither at all.
Exactly.
Okay, so gender queer. People typically reject notions of static categories of gender and embrace the fluidity of gender identity. So genderqueer seems like you could be anything at any point. Anyone?
Yes, but a lot of times that's not associated with sexual orientation. I think I've heard people, and again, this is a learning experience for me, and I am the executive director of the LGBT Center.
So you should know your stuff, George, and you don't.
Should.
That's what you're saying. You don't know anything.
Yeah, I don't hear people typically my age say that, but I have heard, teenagers say that.
Right. Okay. One more before we get going. Pansexual. Describes someone who has the potential for emotional, romantic, or sexual attraction to people of any gender.
Any gender.
So anything goes? I mean, I'm just asking.
It's like saying I recognize that there's men in the world and women in the world and people of other genders, and I have the ability to be attracted to them regardless of what they were assigned at birth or how they identify.
Question, that would not be bisexual. Why?
Because bisexual is you're attracted to your same gender and then another gender.
There you go.
Yeah, it's a more expansive term.
I like options. Options are fun.
Yes.
All right, so Start Canada. One day, do you think we will be able to address people as people or humans and not attach a label? Why does my sexual preference matter? Again, sexual preference versus identity. But again, we talked about that maybe one day we will get there, thanks to conversations like this.
Yeah, in 10 years, the conversation is going to be different. 10 years ago, I didn't think I would be in a studio talking about, with someone who's transgender. It just wasn't on my radar. So as we evolve, the conversations are going to evolve.
Yeah, no kidding. 10 years ago, who would have thought I'd be here as an anchor in Orlando, Florida? Be married by the mayor of Orange County, who's a Republican,
right,
and be embraced by mothers who send me messages on Facebook saying, thank you for being a role model for my son. Yeah. Like, how crazy is that? She obviously doesn't know all the horrible things I do as a human being, but we won't tell her that. All right, so here's a question that I want to lead into a question for Ez. So Sandy Diaz, I do not like labels, but I do not want to be offensive. So if I look at you, Ez, and I say, oh, she was so good on the podcast versus they were so good on the podcast, is that offensive to you if I slip up without meaning to? How does that work?
Oh, people make mistakes all the time. If I don't know someone, I might make a mistake. I might call them the wrong name if I'm just getting to know them and I don't remember if there's a million people in the room. I think that for me, because this is part of my professional and my personal experience in life, when people come to the table and try to be respectful, that's great. And we learn language by repetition.
Right.
So if you just keep repeating someone's pronouns, you're going to get it.
Yeah, and it's really all about intent, right? And the fact that if someone continually misgenders you on purpose, then you know they're coming from a dark place. If they mess up, I know my mom misgendered me forever. She kept using he, him pronouns for me. And one day she said, I knew you for 50 years as Greg. I knew you as a guy. So cut me some slack. And I would, because I knew my mom was coming from a good place.
Right.
And do you still have to cut people slack? Meaning, do you still find yourself, even though you're in a position, you're a leader, you're in a leadership position in the state, people know who you are, people still will make a mistake or not because of what?
Well, personally, I'm fortunate in the fact that I'm somewhat passable. And, that's another whole conversation, the hierarchy of being passable and do you need to be passable in your gender presentation that you've worked so hard to achieve and that kind of thing. That, hopefully at some point in time, that's not a deal. But I don't get misgendered much. And if I do get misgendered, usually it's because
from an ugly place.
It. Yeah, someone's doing it on purpose.
Right. We were talking about that actually yesterday. I have a friend who is misgendered, and we were talking last night. We were at a charity event, and she was having a hard time because a person was misgendering her, but it was definitively on purpose. It was coming from a hateful place. If someone said he and they were corrected and they made the intent to correct that, and it just shows respect, and if you continue then there are issues.
But there are even people in my circle, right, who ask me things like, oh, okay, so he, she, they, pan, who's this and who's that? Why do you have so many? What do I do? Is it LGBTQ plus ISC? And I'm like, first of all, don't be an idiot. Because you're a smart person. Yes, I get the acronym's annoying, but we've, I think, stopped it now, LGBTQ plus. But like, what do you say to someone who you thought was smarter than they were, and they're asking these questions, and it's almost like joking, but not really? Anyone? Has anyone had that happen?
Yeah, if people ask me that about my pronouns, sometimes they say, well, I learned that they and them was plural. And I say, well, if you go back to Shakespearean English, it was they and thou for singular, and we use it as singular all the time. Somebody left their sheet of paper. I wonder if they are going to come and get it, right? We assume it belongs to one person. So it's just really changing your context. And again, if people are trying, I don't know, if someone's joking, I might say, you know what, that's really hurtful because like that's part of my identity, and I wouldn't call you the wrong name, so can you please try to get my pronoun right?
All right, let's get into a couple more labels here. There's queer, which is now we've deemed is, and this is I'm just making this statement. Is queer like the N word where certain people are trying to take it back and make it their own, or is it different? Because at one point queer was offensive, if used offensively, and now it kind of isn't if used properly.
I've used that correlation myself. Some people may disagree, but
sure.
But that's why I took it back, because that word was and it was used towards me negatively. I now own that word. I am queer.
And it's just like the older generations, and some of us here can understand that because we were called that in a negative way as kids. Gina, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I was going to say it's definitely generational in the fact that the millennials and younger people within our community certainly find no offensiveness for the most part. Nothing's perfect. In using the term queer, as a community, as a person describing their own identity. So it's definitely something that's evolving, and queer is becoming more and more a part of our vernacular.
All right, so there's questioning too, a term used to describe people who are in the process of exploring their sexual orientation. So basically teenagers? I mean, anybody, right?
Anybody at any time.
Oh, at one point you were questioning.
I think we all were.
Right.
Yeah.
But I mean, I know adults that, have one sexual orientation until they're 40, and then they wind up with a partner of the same gender.
Well, Gina was a perfect example. You started your transition when you were 50, and you asked about kids coming to the center.
Right.
We have people that are coming into the center that are 60 and 70 years old, and they are just discovering and just realizing, and now have enough, foresight to come and seek that help and ask questions.
So Gina, let's talk about that for a second. As far as your journey, which began at 50, just a mere 3 or 4 years ago, it's amazing how you've adapted so well in just a couple of years. But seriously, how was that for you?
Well, first of all, I knew I was transgender when I was 4 years old.
Okay, tell us that story really quickly.
My sisters convinced me to dress up in the basement. We lived in Rockaway, New Jersey, and I dressed up with my sisters and her girlfriends. And when they finished putting nail polish on me and putting lipstick on me and this flowery dress, I felt for the first time that I could breathe.
Really?
And I know that that's truly who I was. But at the time, there weren't the resources, there wasn't the knowledge. I didn't know what this meant. So I tucked it away. Life went on. And as I grew and played football and, homecoming king and all that kind of stuff, I still was dealing with gender dysphoria.
I love that story about you. Homecoming king, football star. I mean, to some degree, how do you like, hate, appreciate, or indifferent when people compare you to Caitlyn Jenner? And that kind of, where you're at the top of your masculine game and you feel so wrong.
Well, I appreciate Caitlyn's interview and the fact that she really propelled the dialogue 10 years ahead when she said it was Caitlyn who was winning the gold medal in 1976. So that was truly, putting out the concept of gender identity, that is always who she was, even though she was presenting as Bruce. And like me and a lot of people of my generation, resources, timing, knowledge, we waited until we're in, our 40s, 50s, 60s to transition, and it made a powerful statement. While I certainly don't agree with their political ideology, and there's certainly been some mistakes there.
That's a different podcast, Gina.
Yeah. She has done some positive things in reference to those types of concepts in reference to gender identity.
A question for everyone listening out there as far as labels, I wanted to tackle, do labels divide us more? And this one person, Stephen Allen, writing, for example, the other day on Facebook, I saw an event for trans-only pool party / barbecue. I guess I'm just finding it strange because when I have a gathering, it's never a gays only. So obviously it sounds like Steve identifies as a gay man, and he's feeling left out. So who wants to tackle that topic? Are the labels leaving people out? Are you allowed to say, I want cisgendered people at my party, I want people in blue shirts at my party, or how does that work?
Well, I would say that sometimes segregated pool parties for transgender people are because transgender people are in various stages of transitioning. And some are more comfortable in their skin, some are more comfortable in wearing a bathing suit, and perhaps they're not ready for a diverse crowd being there, and are more comfortable with their trans siblings that they more identify with, and perhaps that, the inclusivity of that group is more comfortable.
Fantastic. Does that make sense to everyone else?
Yeah.
People chiming in here saying that we're doing a great job. Thank you so much for kind of talking about this. And the fact the ignorance that cost innocent lives at Pulse should be all the more reason that Under the Rainbow can bring mass acceptance. Do you think that as a community, LGBTQ+, it's our responsibility? How much more can we be doing? Should we be doing? How do we expand the acceptance? We're not trying to convince anyone of anything, right? We're just trying to allow them to just accept. Or do we need them to totally be convinced?
I always like to say that instead of acceptance or tolerance, I always say respect. Because everyone is able to respect another person. You don't have to be living with someone or their best friend or whatever to just respect them as a human being. And kindness is like something that you can just do, on a daily basis. And respect is kindness.
And
George?
You're doing that. Well, you're doing that now, George, because you are opening the conversation and we are educating people. I mean, this is a open conversation with friends, but it's conversation that you have a 15-year-old, you might have a 10-year-old, you have older people listening that have questions. People are writing in. We're answering those and we're educating, and that's fantastic.
And let's talk about that, Gina, talking about educating. When dealing with a 15-year-old, when dealing with a 10-year-old, what do you do? What kind of signs are out there? You're educated in this stuff and you teach other people. What do you do as a parent, as a guardian, as an uncle, as an older brother who's like, look, Mom, about my little brother, maybe a little sister. Like, how do you have that conversation with a parent or as a parent?
Well, the main thing you do is you love them and you support them. We find, parents are looking for resources, and parents are more and more wanting to understand, support, be there for their child so that their child can excel and be who they are and be their authentic selves. And so we see that not only are we seeing school boards making progress, we see the work that EZ is doing in our Safe and Healthy Schools initiative, that more and more of our school districts are stepping up to protect LGBTQ kids, but we see more and more enlightened parents. And nothing is stronger and more powerful than a mama bear who is protecting her transgender kid who's coming into school and maybe getting bullied or harassed. Yep. And we see the full force of knowledge and visibility coming through when that happens.
And let's talk about that as in your role. What does your role look like?
Well,
your day job.
Every day is different, but one of the most important things that I do is I go and provide professional development training to administrators, teachers, paraprofessionals, and student services staff.
So what does that mean? What does that look like?
So our district trainings are 3 hours long. We go through some of this vocabulary, so that's in there. Then we talk about structural constructs around gender identity and sexual orientation. And then we go through the impact of a negative or hostile environment on kids, because we have data from the Florida Youth Risk Behavior Survey that shows that our kids are falling into really gap groups, right? They're hurting themselves. They're being truant, not coming to school because they're worried about being picked on or hurt. They don't find a supportive adult at school. They might not have a supportive adult at home. So just really giving them tools, talking to student services, school psychologists, social workers on how to best respect and support all of the diversity of our children and families.
For those people listening in Central Florida, the Orlando area, and people around the world and around the U.S., are there people in your position in other school districts? If there aren't specific titles like yours, what should they do? Where should a parent go to say, I think my kid is exhibiting this, or doing, or simple as he or she's picking up a Barbie versus a truck? I mean, these are very elemental questions, but you know what I'm getting at. Where should they go?
Well, when we're talking about schools, our Safe and Healthy Schools program is in 42 of 47 school districts in Florida right now. So our director, a wonderful Dee Palazzo, is able to talk to anyone in any district. And in Pinellas, we call our team the prevention team. So it's anti-bullying, mental health, and LGBTQ. So you can call them, and they have district legal services that they can help with if it's a parent wanting to support their child in school and they're not getting that support from teachers or administrators. So a lot of counties in Florida, and actually I moved here from Minneapolis, where I was a statewide director up there. So this is happening in schools, and it's really great.
And George, it's also happening at centers around the country, right? Because this is almost like, when did you start having to deal with not deal with in a bad way, I mean, have to accept and learn and help the non-binaries, the transgender, like you said? When did that start?
I think we always have, but I think that as we've evolved and some of these terms are now in light, I will use autism as an example. People had autism 30, 40 years ago, but they didn't call it autism. People were transgender. They just, they didn't have a place to go. Now that they do, as we evolve, we're not going to be hidden anymore also. I mean, when the center started 40 years ago, it was a hotline, and it was a place where people would call, and were the social gatherings. That's what it was. And then the LGBT newspaper was delivered in a brown paper bag in Orlando. It's true. So, and now we have the Watermark, and we have Huffington Post, and we have Facebook, and we're visible. So we've been serving this community for as long as we've been in existence. But in 10 years, who are we going to be serving? What are the labels going to be in 10 years? I don't know. And
you know what I love about every response that I've gotten on my Facebook page, Jorge Estevez, WFTV, and everywhere we put it? People are like, this is great, this is wonderful, I don't want to offend anyone, what do I do? There's a question from Keith Davenport. How do you best open a discussion to people on their thoughts outside of the LGBTQ plus community? Cis, pan, trans terminology. How do we do that? How do we talk to someone when someone asks us a question or is curious? Or maybe like asking us a question that may be a little offensive, but they don't mean to be offensive. How do you tackle that?
Well, sometimes it's powerful to open the conversation with when you introduce yourself, simply by saying, "Hi, I'm Gina Duncan. My pronouns are she, her, hers. What are yours?" And that person may be a little bit uncomfortable.
Talk about
and
an
not used to
icebreaker,
that.
Gina.
But yeah, and they're like, "Well, so why are you asking me that?" So then the conversation can grow from there. So oftentimes it's like, "This is my validation. This is who I am. So and you respect my identity, and I want to do the same for you." So it's a respective, validating statement that can effectively open a conversation.
As we start to wrap up here, what have you seen that strikes you in your talks and your lectures and when you're teaching people stuff around the state and the country?
Really seeing the needle moving in the fact that I've always said that visibility will lead to awareness, and through awareness, people will get educated. And when people are educated, we'll truly finally get to a point of being in an equality environment and experience equity in societal institutions. We see that major corporations are getting it, but we see other parts of our society like law enforcement and even healthcare are racing to catch up and understand the transgender and non-binary communities. So there's a lot of work still to be done.
George, is there a moment that you can remember, an aha moment or a moment you're like, okay, we're going somewhere, we're not going somewhere, this was sad, this was very happy today that this happened, regarding labels and all that?
So I moved back from Indianapolis to take the job at the center in December of 2017. So when I got here, I found a new primary care physician. My insurance kicked in, and I went to the doctor and I filled out the questionnaire. And one of them was, are you gay, straight? That was on. It was the doctor wanted to know, and I'm thinking, oh, it's so that they can treat me better and they can ask me questions about sexual health and be open. And I was discharged as his patient, and this was in 2018 in Orlando.
You were discharged because you identified as gay.
That is my assumption. He came back into the room and said, oh, you need an AIDS test. And I'm like, well, first of all, it's an HIV test. And I know my status. And I can just go to work and get one for free. I'm not going to bill my insurance. And, he did some more probing questions. And I did my annual physical. I got back to my office, and at 2 o'clock, his nurse called me to cancel my 3-month follow-up appointment.
Sad, but still.
Sad, but true.
Proof that there's so much more to do.
And we hear that at the center. And when people call in, and I'm just like, oh my gosh, is this really happening? And then it happened to me. So yes, it is happening. So educate, educate, educate.
Ez, do you have a moment, a takeaway from your experience?
I have something that actually just happened in a training. A lot of times we talk about data and statistics, and we were talking about the statistics that trans students try to commit suicide at least once, 42%, as reported by GLSEN. And then we got into homelessness. 90% of the kids that we serve or see through homeless shelters identify as LGBTQ. Actually, it's like 40%, but they only represent 3 to 7% of the youth population, so super disproportionate numbers, right? And after I got done talking about that statistic, a teacher in the room raised her hand, and she had a T-shirt on that said "Hope" in rainbow colors. And I said yes, and she said, I'm really thankful to be here and that all these people are in the room with me who are educators because I lost my son. And at first, I thought she had a gay son who ran away because we had just gotten done talking about homelessness. But in her next sentence, she said, no, he was a transgender boy, and he took his life 4 years ago. So I was stunned. And I know that we do this work every day, and we see these stats. But for everyone in that room to have that moment of feeling that, like, this is why we do the work that we do, right? To save our youth, really, and definitely educate our communities on how to best do that.
And that's really the point of starting this podcast, Under the Rainbow, and the point of starting with this particular topic is it really struck me. So many people have these questions, and we are talking about it more and more because we're seeing more and more, whether it's in Hollywood, whether it's in our neighborhood, whether it's in leaders in the community, whether it's elected officials, whether it's news anchors. We're seeing more diversity. So I want to thank you guys. I think that's a wrap. I think we did.
Wow.
All right.
We've
That
been-
was very enjoyable.
We've been talking for like 40 minutes, I think.
It seems like 4. Like, literally. It's crazy.
Well, for the person listening at home, they'll be like, thank God it's over.
It's been 4 hours.
Are there more pages of this?
No, look, listen, I want to thank you guys so much for really, really just taking part in this. Gina Duncan, your title and who you work for?
My title is I'm the Director of Transgender Equality at Equality Florida.
Gina Duncan, everyone. Good job.
Thank you, everyone out there.
All right, George?
The Queen of Orlando. Oh, no, I'm sorry. I am the executive
Gina
director.
or you? Who are we talking about here?
No, you me. I'm sorry. You are the Queen of Orlando.
He was looking right at me when he said that.
The executive director of the LGBT Plus Center, thecenterorlando.org, and we're 946 North Mills. Come visit us.
All right, George Wallace, everyone. Big round of applause for him. He, him, his, and Ez Rodriguez.
I'm a Pinellas Safe and Healthy Schools Coordinator with Equality Florida, and I'll take the king position.
Yes. Well, how about just royalty?
Royalty.
There we go. Fantastic. Thank you all for coming. Seriously, it is a gift for me to be able to do this with such amazing people. 2 of you were friends of mine. I just met you, and I feel like I've known you forever. Thank you so much, Ez. You get the award for driving the longest distance all the way from...
St. Petersburg.
Fantastic. Well, thanks for not driving back tonight. And hopefully you'll have a friend
take
here
it
you can
easy
stay
tonight.
with. Fantastic. Thank you guys so much, and thank you guys at home for listening. And as always, thanks for coming under the rainbow. I'm Jorge Estevez. Hi, Will.
Hello?
What do I call you? Do I call you Will, Wheezy, William?
Wheezy, producer Wheezy, producer Willie, William,
Producer?
Will.
Will, folks, everyone, is fantastic. He's the producer, the mastermind of everything that plugs into a socket. He's
Something like that, yeah.
So what did you think? So after every podcast, we're going to just kind of chat and debrief because I'm curious what you think. The podcast is called Under the Rainbow. We talk about LGBTQ plus issues. You identify as a straight guy, and
I'm the resident straight man
exactly,
in the room.
Literally. So what did you think? We talked about labels and pangender and transgender and he, she, they, and all that
Well,
stuff.
first off, everybody on the whole panel, you included, of course, was awesome. Everybody had something educational and powerful, personal. They didn't hold back to bring to the table, which is what you want. That's exactly what you want. So they really brought me into it, and I almost would forget to change a shot or something back there listening in because I was getting pulled into the conversation.
So what did you think of all that? Everyone's personal stories.
It was awesome. I'm very happy they opened up, and the fact that Gina actually transitioned, I won't say late, but in her seasoned.
Sure, 50.
Seasoned,
50, yeah.
50 is crazy because you think about all like younger, and you think about that happening at an earlier time.
Yes, and even as a member of the LGBTQ plus community, identify as a gay man, just hearing the stories of everyone has a different story, and everyone's journey to get to where they are today is so different. I mean, my story is different than Gina's story. Than I am a gay man. I am a man who's attracted to men. Identify as a man, I should say. And then there's Ez, who really said she came out twice.
Yeah.
When you remember that when she said that? What did you think when she said that? First as a lesbian and then as a non-binary and
Well, I just think it's almost like anything else humans do. It's just completely fluid, and nothing is set in stone. Nothing is written in stone. And her finding herself, I mean, they finding themselves.
See, exactly.
I'm
It
still learning,
happens.
and I feel comfortable to talk about it like that because, as said, there's no offense.
'Cause you don't
putting
mean
yourself there. I don't mean it, no offense, as whenever you watch
He's
this.
staring at the camera right now.
Whenever you watch this.
But that is true. And then George taking away the fact that, as the LGBT plus center in Orlando, he sees all sorts of people, young, older, going through moments in their lives, and they're second guessing themselves. And then that could lead to tragedies and people taking their own lives or hurting themselves or becoming homeless because their families don't accept them. So that's the part that struck me too.
Yeah. I mean, it literally is life or death in some cases, which people don't think about this. People think, oh, they just want to identify. They want to have their gay pride parade. They want to do this, that, and the other. And it's like, no, these things literally cost people their lives sometimes. And that's why it's so awesome that you're having these conversations and putting them out so publicly.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Will, and thank you for agreeing to do this with me. This is the first of many. So this was fun. I like a little post chat. What do they call this in the sports world? Monday morning quarterbacking?
I don't know. I'm a big soccer fan, and over in England they have like Monday night football, or
Football.
Yeah, something like that. We can call it our fireside chat.
Fireside chat.
TV side chat.
Fantastic. William, folks, thank you so much. All right, brother, thank you. Till the
First
next
of many.
time. Exactly, first of many. Thank you so much. Till the next time you join us under the rainbow.
Recorded in the Parish Healthcare Podcast Studio.